Hello, and welcome back to my Color Theory for Markers series. Today, I'll be showing you how I shape and shade a yellow daffodil with Copic markers and colored pencils. I use a lot of color theory in my work, but I know from having sat through several college level theory classes that the topic of color theory, well, it can be kind of boring. I mean, you can only stare at a color wheel for so long. I don't know about you, but I learn best with markers and pencils in my hands rather than listening to somebody talk about it. So I've created this color theory series to show you color theory in action. I'm working today with markers and colored pencils, but color theory is universal. Everything we're doing today also works for watercolors, acrylics, oil paint, pastels, even kitty crayons. Color theory is universal, so use whatever medium you like. Today, I'm using the color yellow, and the opposite of the color yellow is violet. We call these complements. There's a magical thing that happens when you mix or layer complements. If you put yellow and violet side by side, there's an electrical current between those two colors, any two complements. They kind of vibrate next to each other. But when you mix those colors, or you start to layer yellow with violet and yellow with violet, they start to make these wonderful shade colors, and I use those for realistic coloring. The color of yellow shade is not more yellow, and it's definitely not orange or brown. The color of yellow shade happens naturally when we layer yellow with violet. Let me show you how. And hey, if you want to see my color selection process and see how I picked the specific yellows and violet markers for this video, I live streamed a color testing session where I swatch a bunch of Copics and colored pencils to find a great combination for our daffodil today. The link is down below in the description. Before we get started coloring today, though, I wanted to introduce you to something that most card makers and coloring book colorers have probably never used before. It's called a color study. In my classes and in discussion groups, I meet a lot of beginners and marker fans who say that they're practicing their coloring skills. And by practice, they usually mean that they're coloring a project. And when that's done, they'll color a new project. And when that one's done, they'll color another one after that. But folks, calling it practice doesn't really mean you're actually practicing anything. Practice with no goal other than to color better isn't practice at all. It's just fumbling around in the dark, hoping that someday you'll color something that kind of magically looks better than anything that you were doing before. It's like leaving on a vacation with no car, no hotel reservations, no plane ticket, no suitcase full of clothes, and absolutely no plan. Doing more of the same thing isn't practice. It's just more of the same thing. So in this series, we're going to be coloring a bunch of 4 by 4 inch color studies. Today, we're coloring a daffodil, and I hope that this is the first of many daffodil studies because we're practicing how to render a yellow object in a realistic or maybe even an artistic way. We're coloring a daffodil, but it's not about the daffodil. It's about yellow. We're practicing yellow. So if you get bored with coloring the 10th daffodil, find a banana and start coloring bananas, or find a yellow rosebud or a lemon. We're studying yellow. We're practicing yellow. So here are the rules for our color studies in this series. First of all, small. This is not a full-size project. This is a small exercise. I recommend coloring it 4 inches by 4 inches. Second rule, 30 minutes. I want you to set a timer and stop when the timer goes off. If you cannot complete most of a study in 30 minutes, then you need to be working on something a little bit more like a beginner level skill. Number 3, have a goal. Today, we are trying a new yellow marker blend. It may take several studies before you find a blend that you actually like. Then maybe you could work on improving your pencil technique or finding better pencil colors, or figuring out when and where to apply the colors. Practice one specific skill. All right, fourth rule. I want you to do this regularly. Don't wait for me to release a new video before you color your next daffodil. I'm here to give you the prompts. I'm not leading you by the hand, and I'm not going to coach you through every step of the coloring process. This only works if you practice on your own and if you do it at least a couple times a week. All right, fifth rule. You are allowed to fail. In fact, it's actually good when you fail. Don't go into a color study thinking that you need to color the perfect daffodil. Perfect is not the point. Make lots of mistakes and learn from each one of them. Sixth rule. You are not allowed to make a card out of your daffodil today. You're not allowed to give it away. I want you to save your studies, every single one that you do. I want you to save them on a ring or put them in a box or save them in a binder. I want you to be able to look back at them periodically. Look at what worked and look at what didn't work. Learn from those mistakes, identify the mistake, and then learn from the mistake so that you don't keep repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, so the daffodil image that we're coloring today is part of the Spring 2023 Color Theory Kit. The daffodil is one of the downloads. It's a small, simple digital stamp. I've placed 4 digital stamps on an 8.5 by 11 sheet, and then I reduced the opacity from black lines to gray lines so that those gray lines can disappear when I color over them. I've printed the 4 images onto an 8.5 by 11 sheet of Cryogen 89-pound cardstock. It's the color Curious Metallic White. If you're a beginner, I recommend using Express It blending card instead because that one works a little bit better for beginners. It's a self-blending card. Then I cut the images into 4 by 4 inch squares, which left me a nice sized bottom margin, which I will be using to test marker blends and swatch yellows sometime in the future. Last, I used a bit of 1/4 inch artist tape to protect the margins. You can use washi tape if you have it in black or plain gray or plain white if you have it. You can't use anything with patterns on it or distracting colors. I want you to focus on the image, not looking at your pretty washi tape around the edges. Taping the margins for markers is a little bit different when it's done for paint, colored pencils, or pastels. With marker, you cannot color over the tape because the marker ink is going to soak under the tape and it won't leave clean straight lines. So when I color the background, you'll see that I kind of use the tape as a guide or a suggestion. It's not the outer boundary. You can skip the tape if you want. But I find that if I don't warn students about the margin, they color all the way out to the 4 edges of the paper, and then they waste a lot of time and a lot of ink trying to make edges look good. Edges are never going to look good with marker. You can't color over the edge because the ink soaks around the edge and darkens the outside perimeter. The tape is just there to remind you to stop coloring before you encounter any problems by coloring the edge. So let's start coloring. In last week's video, I showed you how I swatch colors, and I tested a bunch of different violets for underpaint for our daffodil. So the colors that I'm using today in today's coloring demonstration are exactly what I picked out last week. That's going to be V12, and then over the top of it is Y15, Y13, and Y11. You'll hear me refer to the violet as the underpaint because that's the process I'm using it for. So I have my digital stamp and I'm turning it so that the daffodil is pointing in the same direction as the photo reference. And I'm going to start with the trumpet here. I have V12 in my hand and we're going to start the underpainting process. So I'm finding the edge where the trumpet meets those petals and I'm flicking inward. Then I will come to where the trumpet flares at the end, and there's going to be a little bit of shade behind that flare, and I just knocked it back a bit with that V12. Switching to Y15, and I'm going to go over the top of the violet, and that's what's going to make that Dijon mustard color that we found last week. So I'm flicking right over the top of it. Nobody is going to know that that violet is there. And now I'm coming into where those petals are overlapping the trumpet, where the lip of the fluttery part at the end is overlapping the base of the trumpet, and just putting in some extra Y15 along there. Now I've got the Y13, and I'm just continuing the process, building in the color of the trumpet there. Finding where it's overlapped by the petal and flicking inward. Now here's that Y11, and this is my blending coat going over the top of the Y13, going over the top of the Y15, and over the top of the violet. And now I'm just going to let the Copic Fairy blend it for us. You shouldn't have to nurse those blends if you're truly coloring at an advanced level. Now I'm back with the V12 again, and I'm coloring the darkness that gathers inside the trumpet. So we're inside the bell, and that's the V12 with Y15 over the top of it, flicking outwards towards the outer edge of that trumpet. Now kind of adjust it, look at what I've done, and now I'll come in with the Y13. It goes over the top of the violet. The Y13 goes over the top of the Y15. And I'm always flicking outwards so that if any of my strokes show, they're kind of in that flared motion that the trumpet normally has. Here's that blending coat of Y11 going over the top of everything and melting it out nice and smooth. If you're having trouble with the blends, I do have a basic blending course. But remember, this video is kind of more of an advanced level. So I'm assuming that I don't have to explain the blending process to you here. All right, so I've got the inside of the trumpet and the outside of the trumpet. Now we've got just that little bit of flare that comes over the end of the bell towards us. And I've darkened just a little bit because that's what I'm seeing in the photo reference. And then coming along with, there's no underpaint. It's just the Y15 is the dark, and then a little bit of Y13 over the top. And now I'm blending it out with the Y11 so that this front lip that comes over the edge is lighter and brighter. Now let's work on those petals one at a time. So this petal is probably the darkest of the bunch, and I've darkened it with some V12. But remember, in our photo reference, we thought that that color was a little green. So I'll be coming back later with some overpaint with a green pencil to darken it even more. I don't want to build in too much of that Dijon mustard color because I want a yellow with a green over the top of it later. So same markers that I've been using, the V12 in that little depth of corner, and then the Y15 over the top of that, Y13 out even farther, and then blended completely with Y11. Now let's do the top one where I do see some Dijon mustard color. So there's that V12 right in the photo reference where I see it. I'm coming over the top of it with the Y15, flicking out towards the point of the petal. So I'm always flicking in the direction that the petal is growing. Then the Y13 now extends that area, and there's a little bit of curl under. And I want to build a little bit of darkness under there. So that's the Y13 there, and then the Y11 comes down over the top. And that's going to give me just a really subtle little curl on the end of the petal. Petal by petal, one at a time. I don't underpaint everything at once and then come back and add all the Y15 and then come back and add all the Y13. I go petal by petal, looking at the photo reference, matching my colors to what I see in the photo reference, getting the same general shape, and I'm focusing on one petal at a time so that I can color that one petal to the best of its petal ability. And then I'll move on to the next one. If you're constantly jumping all over to different parts of an image, you're never going to color the objects as well because you don't know them as well. I study one petal and I color one petal at a time. So there we go. A little bit of underpaint with the V12, then the Y15 over the top of it. This is Y13 because there's a little wrinkle in there, and I want that rise to have some Y11 on top of it, and then blending out with the Y11. Last petal here. This one is nice and big, so I've got some room for some shaping to it. So I've just got no underpaint. Here's the Y15, and I'm putting in that little crease. You'll see that the petal looks like it's kind of doing this. There's a little crease, and that's where that Y15 goes. Y13 over the top of the 15, and then a little bit on the other side, and now blending it out See how I'm getting a petal that's kind of wavy? It's all about where you apply those colors. And that could be something that you're working on with your yellow daffodil study. Now let's work on the stem. And at the top of every daffodil stem, there's a little bit of brown paper that used to be covering the flower. For that combination, I'm using E55 and E53, and I'm going to borrow some of that shady V12 color to add some underpaint. So here I am with that borrowed V12. I borrowed that right from the yellow recipe so that we've got the same color running through the whole entire image. And I'm just shading the top of the brown area where I need a little bit of shade or shadow. And then the E55 goes over the top of the violet. It kind of makes this muddy looking brown color. And then I'm going to take the E53 over the top of the violet, over the top of the 5-5, and bring that down into the stem. So there we go, just finding those edges and then flicking downward along the length of the stem. Now let's switch to the stem. The stem and the background are very close in color, and I'm going to use similar colors on both. In the background, I see a bluish, grayish, greenish color, and to me that looks like BG99. I'll combine it with some BG96 and some BG93 for both the stem and part of the background. Now V12 is not strong enough to show up underneath the BG99, so I have to switch to V12's darker cousin, V17, and that has a little bit more purple to it, so it can stand up to these darker greens. So there's my combination, and I'm going to start using them on the stem. Now here comes that V17. I'm close to the tape, but I'm not touching the tape. There's just a little bit of white margin between the end of the stem and the tape because I don't want the ink to leak under the tape. So that's V99 flicking straight up the stem, and then over the top of it comes that BG99, just kind of evening out the bottom line there so it's nice and straight. BG96 goes over the top of the 99. And then I'm going to use BG93. And here's where I'm making a bit of what we call a rebel blend. We're going to go BG into that original E that we had there. So I need that 93 to come up and overlap the bottom of the E53. Now I'm coming back with the E53. I'm going to flick in the opposite direction. And this forms a rebel blend. So we're getting a transition from brown into green, and I'm just going to let those inks merge and make some kind of funky little earthy green color in the middle zone. Now let's work on the background. I'm going to use many of the same markers. I'm going to take out the BG93 because the background is pretty dark, and I'm introducing a sea gray. So that is C6. And here I'm going to speed up the coloring because right now I am just base coating the whole entire image with C6, the whole background of the image. Don't color over your daffodil. So there we go. Just using the tip of my marker to flood the entire background with a nice, slow, generous coat. And you notice I'm never taking that ink right up to the tape. I don't want it to flood underneath. And I'm taking the color right up to the edge of the yellow. In a few places, I'm actually correcting the shape. Like a few of my yellow strokes have gone over the edge. So I'm using that gray because it's darker, and it's kind of refining and correcting the overall shape of these petals. So I'm just flooding it. It's going to look streaky. One coat of marker always looks streaky. But that's okay. We've got several more markers to come. We're using several layers of color to get a nice pseudo black. It's not going to be true black. If you were to pull out just black, it would be the most boring background imaginable. But we're going to use purple over gray over green, and we're going to go back and forth between these colors that we've used elsewhere in the image to build up something that looks kind of like black. So there I am. I'm kind of experimenting with BG96. I thought about drawing that leaf, and then I just decided, no, I don't love that. So this is BG99, just going over the top, and see I've done a couple of coats there. I'm being super generous with the ink because that's what's going to get rid of that streaky background look. Just layer after layer eventually starts to look smooth. I've switched to the V17 for this upper corner, just for a pop of interest up there. The black in this area is just going to look a little bit more purple, and it's going to look a little bit more green down in the opposite corner. There's a little bit more purple up there. But I'm trying to keep this background kind of organic. It's not definite purple in one corner and definite green in the other. This is BG96, and then I came back with some of the V17. Gotta keep my markers straight here. There's that BG96 again. Just kind of coming in and using that to melt the edges of the purple and to smooth out that gray. I'm being super slow with my strokes. I know I've sped this up, but it's the slow repeated strokes that's going to give you a fairly smooth background color. And there we go. So here's where I introduced the colored pencils. And there's an error last week. I suggested that you could use lilac or Parma. Lilac is actually out of production, but you don't need both. So I'm just going to be using the Parma, not the lilac. To me, Copic looks naked without a layer of colored pencil over the top. So I'm using these colored pencils to kind of accentuate and highlight areas and give it a more refined and finished look. Here's that Parma Violet. This is PC1008, and I'm using it exactly in the same place that I used the V12. Now I'm coloring very, very lightly, and I'm using small little repetitive circles. We call this lamb's wooling, and I'm just using it to build up a little bit of the violet color in that recessed area of the trumpet. Here's Grade Lavender, and this is my favorite pencil over the top of yellow. And I'm using it to soften the transition from that Parma Violet that comes out, and then it's going to turn into a little bit of the Grade Lavender and then full yellow. Lavender, the Grade Lavender looks like yellow shade. I'm kind of coming in along the edge and carving out some ruffles and waves along the edge there. So I'm using the Grade Lavender to sculpt in those waves and make it seem like it's more than just a jagged edge, it's actually dimensional ruffles. So you see the difference between a jagged two-dimensional edge and waves, and that's what that Grade Lavender is doing. Always very lightly. I do not press hard at all with the colored pencil. You want the marker to show through. Now here's the thing. Shade with a complementary color is an acquired taste. And with colored pencil, the last pencil that you use is always the one that we see. So with violet on the top, that's going to look like I used violet. That's what this yellow ochre pencil is for. It's going over the top of these purple areas, and it's kind of masking the purple a bit and shifting it back into the dirty yellow family. So I'm using that ochre just to taste, putting it over the top of the violet to kind of make the violet seem less purpley and more yellow. All right, so right here, I'm on that ruffled edge that comes down over the front of the trumpet towards you. And I'm just using that Grade Lavender again, just building in some little ruffles and waves like I see in the photo reference. So I'm always looking back there at the photo reference. I didn't draw from this photo reference, so my ruffles are different than what's in the photo reference, but I'm using the photo reference as inspiration to create my own unique ruffles. I'm just doing what looks and feels correct for the area, just using my artistic instinct. And that's something that you could be practicing with these daffodil studies, just working on artistic instinct and where things need to be shady and desaturated, or where to leave them nice and bright, developing sculptural forms. So working on that outside rolled edge of the trumpet, just making it seem like it is rounded, and then separating the trumpet from the petals. And I'm still using the same pencils, that Parma Violet, the Grade Lavender, and then doing the yellow ochre over the top of it. So you can kind of think of that Parma as a super push. The lavender is a gentle push, and the ochre is just the lightest touch of push. When we're pushing, we're making something darker and deeper and looking farther away. We're pushing it visually away from us. In my online classes, I do give better, more complete instruction. So I'll tell you exactly what pencil I'm using and why we're using it in certain places. Remember, what we're doing here today is just inspiration. It's really for people who are already familiar with color and already working on these concepts. It's not a step-by-step guide to coloring the perfect daffodil. Remember, we're practicing here. So focus, if you're working on shaping those petals, then that's what you're practicing and that's what you're placing your time and effort on. But you're never going to get that if you're just following my instructions. Pick up your yellow pencil, use it here. Pick up your purple pencil, use it here. That's never going to get you anywhere close to doing something artistic with markers because you're following instructions, not following your instincts. You'll see me work back and forth between the yellow pencil and those purple pencils. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at the area, I'm evaluating whether it looks as deep or as dimensional as I want it to look. And if not, then I come back and I add more purple. And it's kind of this give and take process where you put a little purple down, add some yellow, decide that you need some more, add some more purple and some more yellow. And that's how these layers of colored pencils start to stack up. But they're always really light layers, and I'm never trying to hide the Copic below it, and I'm absolutely never burnishing. I never burnish with colored pencil. Even when it's 100% colored pencil with no Copic below, I still do not take things to the burnished level. I just don't like that glassy surface look to it. I don't like the sheen that it gets from the side. I always leave things just a little bit toothy. And that's actually a more comfortable way to work because I can always come back and fix mistakes, push them more, pull them more. By not burnishing, by not using too much pressure, I'm leaving myself open for later fixes. Just like I did with the Copic, I'm going petal by petal. And I'm really focusing, okay, I'm looking at the photo reference. What does that petal do? Looking at the shape here, what do I want it to do? And I'm focusing just on that one petal. I'm not thinking about all the other petals. I'm going one by one so that I'm really studying the shape or the three-dimensional form of that petal. And really all I'm doing here is the pushing. And I know that colors tend to think that you have to shade something and then you have to highlight it. I have not highlighted anything here yet. I will eventually, but the highlights are just like 2% at the final end. The pushing is what creates the shape and the dimension. So if you cheat those pushes in favor of bringing out a white gel pen, it's not going to look as realistic. I spend 98% of my time with those colored pencils pushing things deeper than I originally got with the marker. That's why I'm talking about the colored pencil, highlighting or better defining the shape. The Copic gives me the general form. The pencil allows me to sculpt it with more detail. And I rotate my paper as I work. I'm looking at it from different directions. Now let's start to add some of that green shade. Remember that petal that we saw a lot of green shade here? This entire petal here is on the back side of the daffodil. It still looks too close to us. And that's because the yellow is too clean and too pure. And you can see in the photo reference how much green is on that poor little petal. It's way back in there. It's deep, it's dark, it's shady, it's desaturated. This is that kelp green Prismacolor number 1090. It's a transparent green so that yellow can still shine through a little bit, but I've got to push that a lot deeper to make it feel like it's sitting on the opposite side of the daffodil. So you see, I'm holding the pencil from far away. Don't use colored pencil in writer's position. So writer's position is when you are choked up really close. And what that does is it gives you more of a perpendicular approach to the paper. You want to be back. Hold it back farther. It's harder to press hard from farther away. And this is coloring position as opposed to writer's position. We're not writing a check here. We're not writing our name. We're not signing our taxes. We're coloring. So you want to be from coloring position. So I'm just going through with this green and adding even more pushes than I did with the Parma Violet. But with this green, I'm going really, really lightly, and I'm not hiding the purple, and I'm not hiding the Copic, and I'm not burnishing. I'm using a little bit of an eraser right there because I got a little carried away with the green. There's nothing wrong with pulling out an eraser and cleaning up an area that you didn't intend to put pencil in. And that's the nice thing about coloring really lightly, so you can always come back with an eraser and kind of ease that edge, clean it up. So continue to work my way around these petals. This is another one that's back in there deep. So I'm going to use just a little bit of this green, not as much as I used on the bottom one. And actually, if I'm perfectly honest, when I'm looking at the replay here to do the voiceover, that bottom petal, that one that we started with, if I could do it right now, I would go back and I would add even more green to it because it's still a little too bright and clean in there. That's the thing. After a couple of days, you kind of look at it with fresh eyes and you say, ooh, I could have used more. If you've already burnished the paper, you can't go back and add more. But I can always go back and add more because I'm never adding so much pencil that I'm mowing down the tooth and damaging the surface so that you can't add anything more. Think about how much time I've spent here with just this one pencil in my hand. I'm not trying to color a green daffodil. I'm going very, very lightly, adding little bits, but there's a lot more there than you think. Very, very light layers, just using it to sculpt that dimensional form. I like to find where the background comes into those little points and crevices, and I'll add extra pushes right in there. Let's make that trumpet a little bit deeper. Just a little bit of green going on in there. I'm using the same colors throughout the image. This kelp green was inspired by the background color. So I'm taking that background color and putting it right into my daffodil. Working slowly, just kind of evaluating what's needed. Here's that lime peel that I talked about in the last lesson. Where a petal comes up and connects right to the stem, you will often find some chlorophyll from the stem, that green stuff from the stem, working its way into the base of the petals. So this is something that I often add to my petals when I'm doing florals. Even if I don't totally see it in the photo reference, it's just another chance to add an artistic pop of unexpected color there. Some light green chlorophyll with a lime peel Prismacolor 1005. Back with that kelp green. I'm working on that paper wrapper here, and I don't have any brown pencils in my collection here. I'm using greens and yellows, that yellow ochre, and also the purples. And those overlapping each other is all kind of giving me that brown flavor without actually using a brown pencil. Parma Violet is pushing that brown paper back below that stem or back below those petals. And then I don't want it to look too purple. So I've got some ochre going over the top of it. This kind of, the ochre helps bring it back into the brown feeling. Then I'm coming in with the kelp to start to color, just pushing the base of the stem deeper. And then where that rebel blend is, using that ochre to kind of transition between brown and green. I love playing with these unexpected pops of color. I don't think you would think to use purple on top of brown, but hopefully I'm challenging you to try something new and different, and you may really appreciate the effect and like it so much that you use it in your own projects. Just kind of finessing it. Now I'm going to work on the background. And for the background, I've actually pulled out another pencil. It's called Black Cherry Prismacolor 1078. And what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of going over the background very, very lightly. I'm cleaning up the outside edges of those petals and just adding just a little bit of grape jelly flavor to this area. And I'm going to also pull out that kelp color, and I'm going to be doing purple over green and green over purple, and it's all going over those background colors to create what we call a pseudo black. It's not real black, it's fake black. When you build up the green over purple over green over purple, it's all going to start to look kind of muddy and dark and deep and mysterious. And it's going to look better than black because it's not just a flat black Copic 110 or 100. So you'll see me switch back and forth. I've sped this up because this takes some time. I don't want to have a 40-minute video here. It probably will end up being 40 minutes, but I don't want it to be too long. So I'm speeding this up because this is really the part where I turn on the radio and listen to some music and just kind of enjoy the background process. I'm not trying to create depth or shape or anything. I'm just filling in color. So this is more relaxed and kind of a fun end to the project. You'll see me tilting my project because colored pencils reflect the light slightly differently. Okay, time for some highlights because I just decided that, yeah, let's throw that in there. Now, I'm not using white gel pen. I'm using a cream colored pencil, which is actually very light yellow. For cream, it doesn't stick to the paper as well, so you do almost have to press just a little bit more. But I'm doing very small little hits of highlight. You don't need a lot of highlight to make a statement. And in my experience, most beginners and most card makers use way too many highlights for realism. It gives your project a flatter, more cartoony feel to it. So I'm just adding, I'm finding like right here, here's a little edge where that little ruffle comes down over the barrel of the trumpet. And I'm just using a little bit of cream there to pull that ruffle forward. I'm not putting any of this cream where there's purple because those purple areas are pushes. These are pulls. I'm doing the opposite. So I'm almost always here coloring over clean yellow that does not have any colored pencil over the Copic. And there we go. The final project with my colored pencils. That's it for my daffodil demonstration. Now it's your turn. It's time for you to practice. Color a few daffodils on your own. Use soft hints of violet to turn those yellow flat shapes into three-dimensional looking forms. This is applied color theory. Color theory isn't about the wheel. It's about using the wheel to find new, unusual, and artistic ways to use color. We use the color wheel to find the opposite of yellow. Violet sits directly opposite of the wheel from yellow. It's the complement of yellow. When you layer or you mix two complements, you start to develop what looks like shade and shadow. Now we're using this secret color theory violet knowledge to give three-dimensional form to a daffodil. Let's see what you can do now. It's time to practice yellow.